ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker developers and FileMaker enthusiasts. This is Matt Petrowski bringing you yet another FileMaker tutorial video where we are learning more about FileMaker. And you can find more videos over at my magazine website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video tutorial, we're taking a look at the topic of relationship-based data filters. And we're going to be extracting the data that you want to see. So basically this came about because of a Facebook post that I saw. We're going to take a look at that, and then we're going to look at the file and understand how we can get pretty much whatever we want through a relationship. Doesn't mean it's always the best way, but it is a way to extract your data. All right, so here is the post that I saw on Facebook and the long number of replies that were going back and forth in order to solve this problem. And in short, I can let you read it on screen. Basically, he has a checkbox field that he's attempting to use that has a group of employee names. And what he wants to do first is he wants to, when he opens the window, he wants to have all of the checkboxes for all employees checked. And he wants this to happen automatically. Now that's going to be a pretty easy one to solve, and the information was provided in this list of how you do that. It's with a particular function with the the value list items design function. But also he wants to have a button with that will filter invoices and basically omit any employees that he would choose to uncheck or just show employees that he would check. Basically what he's doing is he wants a dynamic system here where when he makes his selections based on checkboxes that he checks, he sees those employees, or he might be able to see the inverse. Now, throughout the course of their discourse here in the comments, it looks like Tom Geller was providing a lot of help to Lonnie here. And basically what they were talking about was the solution that he was coming up with was using a loop in order to actually recreate a find. In fact, I think... there we go, right there. There is, and let's see if I zoom in, it might come in a little bit better. Enter find mode, set a variable, there's a counter. They're going to cycle through all of the different employees with a loop and perform the find. So they're going into find mode, looping. The one thing that's missing here that's actually mentioned in one of the comments is a new record request. In other words, keep creating a new request for all of the different pieces of data that is being searched for. Now, this is probably a very low impact way because you write one script, you can go find whatever you want as long as you're passing in the information of what you're looking for. In this case, he's looking for all active employees in a dedicated table. This gave me a little bit of insight into the fact that, you probably know this. With FileMaker, there are so many different ways that you can solve a problem. It really depends on how your users are going to be interacting with the data. There is no one way in order to solve something within FileMaker. There are certainly one way to do certain types of things, but not as an overall with regards to solving problems. So let's take a look at what I came up with in terms of my answer to this particular problem, and we'll basically learn a little bit more about FileMaker along the way. Okay. So here we are, we're going to break down the problem into all of its individual parts. Now, the first thing that I recognize about the discussion that was going on in Facebook is, the first thing is the data structure itself. Now, you can disagree with me, but for the most part, I tend to approach my database systems from the standpoint of entities. An entity in this particular situation is that I have a person. And a person as an entity stands alone. Whether or not they are an employee is a non-issue. The entity itself is the person, and in many database systems, I will only ever create one table in order to store all people, regardless of what type of role, position, attributes, whatever fit those people. Now, this is contrary to what I was reading in the thread and many times what I see when people design their database systems. Let's take a look in the defined database. So here in the defined database, what I will commonly see in a FileMaker solution is I will not see a people table. What I will see is I will see a classification of a type of person, such as a customer table. then right next to that customer table, I will see an employees table. And I currently have an employees table, but let's just say for the sake of one not being there, that it would be created. Now, employees and customers, let's say don't save on that. Employees and customers, as I zoom in here, these are the same thing. They are a person. A person is a customer and a person is an employee. And a person can both be an employee and a customer. And in the context of what was being discussed on the Facebook thread, that is exactly the case. It sounded like this person was trying to find all of the invoices that had been placed by active employees, potentially in order to distinguish them from customers who are non-employees. Now, if you're going to structure your database and you're going to do it from a non-entity standpoint, you're basically going to end up with the potential for duplication. In other words, if I have a table called customers and I add myself as a customer, but then later on down the road, I become an employee and I add myself as a record over there, guess what? I've just duplicated that data, and that really isn't the purpose of a database in order to centralize data and only have one of something. So my goal with this example file is to basically show you that if you treat people or treat objects as the entities that they are, and then give them designations, it gives you a little bit more in terms of data flexibility. So enough on that particular topic. Let's get rid of that customer table. I'm going to hold down the Option key and force delete this with the also remove occurrences and delete that. I don't want customer anymore. And what I have now is I simply have people, employees, and invoices. But in this situation, the way that I've implemented this, employees does not contain information about the person, such as their first name and last name. As we'll see, employees actually contains information about their employment status. And we're going to see that when we take a look at our developer layouts so that we can see the data behind the scenes. So the first place that we're going to go now, after we've taken a look at the defined databases, we're going to go to our Manage Layouts, which you can also find under the File menu, and you can find that under Manage and Layouts. And we're going to bring up some developer layouts. Now, I like to prefix my developer layouts with the @ symbol right here, and we can bring up the, I don't know, this one is still called Technique, even though it's based off of this table right here, which is actually not the Technique, it's Layout People, but we're going to look at employees right here. Let's open that one and take a look at how the data is actually structured. So with regards to this employee table versus our people table, what we're going to do is we are going to simply make a designation of whether or not this is an employee first and foremost, and then second, whether or not they are active. Now, just like in the Facebook post, they were using a number field, which is exactly what I should do for any type of Boolean value in terms of whether that employee is active or not. And I have that here with a 0 and a 1. That's going to require a minimum of at least one value list. So as I open up the defined value lists, we're going to see that the most common approach to this is to create a value list, oftentimes named Boolean, with a value of 1. And that's pretty much all there is to it. It's a fixed value list, and it's set to 1. What we're going to do in this situation is we're going to create a relationship basically from the people table based on their unique ID, which I always like to use a unique ID. It's right here instead of a serial number. That is going to tie over to the employees table. This is going to be pretty much a one-to-one relationship, not a one-to-many, although it could be. It's a one-to-one relationship wherein as soon as I click this record, or excuse me, this box, then FileMaker is going to set this related field. If the record doesn't exist, then the record will be created, and I will only ever have one of that ID. So as long as the ID exists here, this value will always switch between 0 and 1. Now, the great thing about that is by putting this into the employees table here, I will only ever have one ID value of any person who is an employee. Now, the thing that this file doesn't actually do is it doesn't account for the fact that if I'm storing all people in this people table, I very well likely will have a mix of customers and employees. So I'm going to leave it up to you to actually come up with a system where you can designate in order to make a person an employee versus a customer, and that customer can never become an employee. For the purpose of demonstration here, I put this box directly on the layout. Typically, I would hide this and provide some other method in order to designate a person as being a potential employee. In this regard, what's happening is if I ever check this box, that means that I get a related record over in the employees table. This means that by default, a person then becomes an employee and they are either active or inactive. The lack of an ID, for example, if I get rid of all of these values, let's go ahead and get rid of them. I'll delete all records right now. So currently what is the situation now is I have a people table with no records in the employee table, and that means none of these people are employees. It's as soon as I actually check the box, which creates the related record, and in this case makes the setting of 1, that this person now is an employee or has been an employee. As soon as I check it inactive, that means that they have been an employee. If I want to make this person no longer ever having been an employee, I would have to actually delete this record. I'm not doing that in this file, but that's just something that you would need to consider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the records again and check all of them as being active or inactive. As I check them, you can actually see that the list of active employees in terms of the checkbox is growing. So the first thing that we need to do, and I'll leave all of the rest of these unchecked, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the actual solution that we have right here for the checkbox, because that's important to know about. I'm going to go into layout mode, and what we're going to do is we're going to see that this is actually 2 objects overlaid on top of each other. Now this is an oldie but a goodie in terms of how we actually present this, but obviously if we're using a number field for our checkbox to identify the active status, it's either going to be a 1 or a 0. And that 1 or 0 in terms of what's displayed here, or I should say 1, 0, or nothing, in terms of my value list of associating that value list of 1, that's really going to be pretty ugly. Nobody wants to see a 1. We want to see the label of the actual checkbox. So we're going to do a little bit of trickery here in that with this field selected, I'm going to choose my conditional formatting, which let me zoom out here. And what I've done is I've set the conditional formatting, I've added one rule, and that conditional formatting simply says true, meaning you are always going to happen no matter what. What I did is I clicked on the more formatting option, and you can see right here, this is the trick. Oldie but a goodie. I basically blasted the size of the font out so large to 500 points that when FileMaker actually renders that 1, that is the label set to the value list of Boolean, it actually doesn't even show in the user interface. So I go into browse mode, conditional formatting took care of it. It blew the 1 up, and the 1 is probably right over here somewhere, hidden outside of the boundaries of the box. So that's a good trick to know about, because what I have now is just the actual checkbox. But you can see when I click, the checkbox itself cannot be checked. That's because in the inspector, when we're in layout mode, and I go to the actual 4th area, the data, I believe it is, yep. Here you can see what I've done is, for this particular field, I have opted to turn the field entry off for browse mode. I do allow it for find mode because when I go into find mode, maybe I want to check that box and find everybody who's active if I'm using FileMaker's find mode. The next part of the equation is really simple. It's basically put a button object on top of the actual checkbox field, align it so that they're both at their edge, and then with that button selected, when I go to my appearance, you can see I've done a little bit of a trick here. Under the indents section, I've actually set it to indent 20 points. And that's 20 points from the edge, which pushes the text right over. This is a button, so I can, of course, make it do whatever I want. Look at the button, and I'm running a script that says active employee. When we look at that script, we can see that it is simply setting the field of the active status, the related field, to not whatever the active status is. So if the active status is 1, not 1 is 0. If the active status is 0, not 0 is 1. It's simply a toggle flip. And finally, we need the commit records on this in particular because FileMaker has a problem in that value lists, when used within checkboxes and radio buttons, will not update the UI until the record has actually been committed. And that's so that the value list, if it's dynamically generated, can actually be updated, and then the UI will refresh with that new value. So that's going to be our next step, actually looking at the value list. Now, in order to get the value list, we need to know who is an active employee. So we're going to head into the Define database. And when we're on the Relationship tab, our context is currently this layout of people. So we've got some really basic connections here. The first one is people to employees. We already saw that this is controlled by that checkbox. If you're checked with the checkbox, that means you're an active employee according to active status. If you're not checked, then it's a 0. And if you have a record in this table, you are an employee. Otherwise, you're not an employee. We also have a basic relationship to invoices, where every person in our people table, regardless of whether you're a customer or an employee or an employee customer, you're going to be able to create invoices for those people. That's pretty much standard. But what we have below it is everything that's used in order to actually filter out the information that we would want to see. And this is all based on the different settings that are needed in order to extract the data that we want to see. Now, one of them, you can see right here, a field that I have added in is const_1. Now, when we look at this particular field, we're going to see that it is quite simply, in the people table, a calculation field. And that calculation field, it is an unstored field, but it's basically resulting in the value of 1. Hence the name const1. Const short for constant, and 1 being used for the value that it returns. Now what this does is it starts to allow me to filter out the data that I want. With a constant as one of my values, I'm able to actually look into the table where active represents a person, and it is a value of 1. So this constant fixed one is going to automatically match all of my active employees. So that's exactly what I've done. I've named the table occurrence active employees, employees being the base table. Now looking at employees, I don't have any information about the person who is an employee because the only thing stored in the employees table is the ID of a person, whether or not they are active, and maybe something like their start date and their end date. And again, I mentioned in this scenario, you probably would only ever have one employee record. But if you think about it, when you're processing the way that you're going to develop a solution, is it possible that a person could become an employee, work for a period of time, leave, and then come back to the company and serve another role as an employee with a different start and end date? Certainly it is. So you definitely want to account for those types of things when you're structuring your schema. But in order to see people, all we have to do is add a table occurrence, and by going through our constant to our active employees, we can now look at and pull up anybody who is an active employee. Using a go-to related record from the context of this people where our layout is based, we'll be able to allow us to stay on that layout and bring up all of the active people who are employees. Likewise, we're going to be able to do the same thing, but in this scenario, the question or the desired end result was I want to be able to arbitrarily select of the people who are active, certain ones that I want versus those that I don't. That simply requires the addition of one extra field. In this case, it's a global field called employees. Now, the cool thing is, whenever you're designing your database, I could have structured this by basically trying to do a find on people looking for the first name or the last name or the full name of a person. But that's not what I want to do. I don't want to look for a people name or a person's name. I want to look for the ID that represents that person's name, because the ID is always going to be canonical. It's always going to be behind the scenes, and it's not as if that ID is ever going to change, whereas a person's name can change. So here we have an employees global, and all we need to do is provide the checkboxes that allow us to filter just down to those people. So if we take a look at this relationship, what we can see is that this relationship is based on whatever ID values are within this global field of employees acting as a multi-key value relating to all people that match those particular IDs. And we're constraining that by only doing it based on our constant one calculated value, looking only at active people. With this relationship in place, what we're able to do is basically finish out the chain by looking at all of the invoices based on that selection. And then finally, we can go directly to those people who are active and being able to bring up those records specifically using a go-to related record. So in the whole of this solution, there are no finds. There's no search that's actually happened. It is 100% filtering our data based on relationships. So we go into browse mode. We've got a check all and an uncheck all. All we needed to do was to populate this value list. Now, how easy is it to actually get all of the values from this list? Well, we can take a look at this on this button directly. When we go into layout mode and we look at the check all button and double click, you're going to see that we're using a single step, and that single step is using a set field. This is where we get this function right here of value list items. Specify the calculation and right there. So within the context of FileMaker, our value list, provided it's going to be getting related values, and it is, those related values are using the relationship where that relationship says use the constant one looking at active employees and only return active employees. So the name of the value list is active employees. And if we take a look at the value list items function, value list items, we can see that it expects two inbound parameters, file name and value list. Well, value list is simply going to be a match of whatever we called the value list, but it wants this file name. Now, FileMaker has done something really nice a lot of the times with its parameters, either unknowingly or knowingly. I don't have to actually go get the other function of get file name. All I have to do is I'm going to use the option key and the left arrow, and I'm simply going to type in get, add my parenthesis, and my closing parenthesis, and that's all I would need to do. I don't actually need to go hunt down the get file name function because I know that the parameter name itself happens to match the name of the function, which is get file name. But it turns out, as you can see above, anytime that you want to reference the exact same file that you're already working in and the file name is the expected parameter, just put double quotes because that will get the current file itself in terms of returning the results. So this is going to return the value list items. Now, one caveat here. Anytime in all of FileMaker development that we have literal quotes where we are referencing something that can potentially be renamed, that is a place where our code could break. And I always promote that it's better to code things so that they're more resilient and won't break. And in the case of value lists, we don't have anything that can solve this problem. When it comes to fields, we can solve the problem. When it comes to scripts and changing the name of scripts, we can solve that problem. With value lists, we cannot. So if I renamed this value list to employee, this would break. So we just need to be aware of that as we develop our FileMaker solution. So this is simply going to set whatever the active employee IDs are right into our field, our global field, which is used as our multi-key for the relationship that shows us all of the invoices. And it's pretty much that simple. We have an uncheck as well, and when we look at that one, that is simply using the same thing. It's a set field, but it's setting it to empty. So in essence, what we're doing is this representation of the field is using the checkboxes. We can see that over here in the Data tab by looking right there. It's a checkbox set, but it is the same field, layout people employees. When we select our other field, which is also layout people employees, we can see that this control style is not a checkbox, it is an edit box, and we can see what's going on behind the scenes. The value list itself is returning the ID values, not the people's names. But in the way that we've structured the value list, the checkbox will actually show the names, but behind the scenes it uses the IDs. You can always check this out by going up to the Manage and Value Lists, looking at the active employees, and if you've never done it before, our option is to use values from a field. We're going to do it through a relationship. But we can see right here that we're using values from the first field of active people. We have checked also display values from a second field, also active people. In this case, the values we're going to return are ID values, not the name full, not the name last, not the name first. We're going to return the IDs because working with IDs is canonical, absolute, and trusted. Working with data that can change, don't want to do it. But we can display the full name as the display value, and by simply checking this option right here of show values only from second field, that means that the checkbox is going to show the full name, but behind the scenes, the ID is what's going to be used. And of course, I'm going to use include only related values starting from a given table occurrence because the table occurrences and the relationships are what's doing the filtering to filter out who's active versus who's not. So, now that we have the value list in place, now that we have the checkboxes, now that we have a script step, which could be a script, we have invoices created for each employee, we can see that the result is basically this. I can check all of the people. You can see that behind the scenes, what it's doing is it's adding all of the ID values. Those ID field values, as soon as they go into the field, act as a multi-key, automatically relate to all of the invoices for all of those particular people. Unchecking a box simply removes that person's ID. In fact, let's see if removing Bob takes off that first ID, which it did. And Bob is removed, and the only people in this list are Chad and Matt. Take out Matt, and all I have is Chad. And of course, on the portals, I can sort these however I want. I can also provide additional filtering using a global field where I would be able to filter this out and just look at the invoices from Chad that include a certain product item or whatever I want to do. The key point being here is that by adding the relationships and some fixed key values, I can filter out whatever data I want. Now there's one thing that we need to be concerned about when we have a large and growing FileMaker solution. When we are going to consider this type of functionality, we have to know that just for the purpose of being able to filter out a small chunk of data, we have added some complexity that requires us, one, to manage that complexity, and then two, determine whether or not it's going to add a lot of performance overhead. By simply having to have all of these table occurrences, which are all being used just for this one functionality, we have to say, is this the type of impact that we want? Granted, it's not a super big impact because your results from this are typically going to be very, very narrow. In other words, the number of people in my solution, unless I have a solution where I have customers and people who have 10,000 invoices, on average is going to be pretty small. So in this case, looking at an employee table, which is very narrow, just has 4 fields in order to determine if they are an employee, then looking at the invoices only specific to that person, this is not that impactful of a relationship because the data that would be returned is pretty lightweight. So if I wanted to, I could select everything here, click the collapse everything, shove it off down to the side, and sort of ignore it in terms of it being feature specific, and then keep the rest of my table occurrences for the actual schema of my data somewhere else. Basically, you can organize things however you would want here in the graph. But I just wanted to point out that you always want to take into consideration what is the performance hit that you're taking when you add on a bunch of extra relationships just in order to add a specific feature. If I was developing this database and it was a very high transaction database with lots of data, with lots of people interacting with it, then I would probably go with the approach that's going to do a query, or even better, I would probably use execute SQL, do that on the server side, make the server hand back a result of all of the IDs, pop that into a portal, and just have the portal show only the data necessary in order to see what I want to see. All right, so there you go. There is a video about relationship-based data filters and how you can use those relationships or those persistent joins, as we should think of them as FileMaker developers, in order to filter out data to see what we want to see. Now again, whenever you're considering filtering, you always have the option to filter based on a find or filter based on relationships. Relationships will add complexity to your graph and some potential performance overhead, where scripting a find is typically going to be very lightweight and fast. And on top of that, as I stated already, you can use execute SQL. So as you saw in this video, I found this particular problem on Facebook in the FileMaker users and developers group. If you happen to have a similar issue where you're trying to solve something, every once in a while I come across these, or people will send them in and it serves as a great example to learn from and create a video. So by all means, feel free to send in your requests for information. I may not be able to respond depending on how busy I am, but I do read everything, and if it warrants it, I'll possibly create a video. So as always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.